I'll try and finish Drawn to the Loadstone Rock, the 24th chapter of The Golden Thread from A Tale of Two Cities. Mr. Lorry is going to go to France because Tellson's kind of has to do that in times of crisis, and Darnay is kind of joking with him, saying he wishes he could go. Among the talkers was Stryver of the King's Bench Bar, far on his way to state promotion, and therefore loud on the theme, broaching the Monsignor, his devices for blowing the people up and exterminating them from the face of the earth, and doing without them, and for accomplishing many similar objects akin in their nature to the abolition of eagles by sprinkling salt on the tails of the race. Him Darnay heard with a peculiar feeling of objection, and Darnay stood divided between going away that he might hear no more, and remaining to interpose his word when the thing that was to be went on to shape itself out. The house approached Mr. Lorry, and, laying a soiled and unopened letter before him, asked if he had yet discovered any traces of the person to whom it was addressed. The house laid the letter down so close to Darnay that he saw the direction, the more quickly because it was his own right name. The address, turned into English, ran, "Very pressing, to Monsignor, heretofore the Marquis St. Evremond of France, confided to the cares of Messrs. Tellson and Co., bankers, London, England." On the marriage morning, Dr. Manette had made it his one urgent and express request to Charles Darnay that this secret name should be, unless he, the doctor, dissolved the obligation, kept inviolate between them. Nobody else knew it to be his name. His own wife had no suspicion of the fact. Mr. Lorry could have none. "No," said Mr. Lorry, in reply to the House. "I have referred it, I think, to everybody here now, and no one can tell me where this gentleman is to be found." The hands of the clock, verging upon the hour of closing the bank, were in a general set of the current talkers past Mr. Lorry's desk. He held the letter out inquiringly, and Monsignor looked at it, in the person of this plotting and indignant refugee, and Monsignor looked at it, in the person of that plotting and indignant refugee, and this, that, and the other, and all had something disparaging to say in French or in English concerning the Marquis who was not to be found. "Nephew, I believe, but in any case, degenerate successor of the Polish Marquis who was murdered," said one, happy to say I never knew him. "A craven who abandoned his post," said another. This Monsignor had been got out of Paris, less uppermost and half suffocated in a load of hay some years ago. "Infected with the new doctrines," said a third, eyeing the direction through his glass in passing. "Set himself in opposition to the last Marquis, abandoned the estates which when he inherited them, and left them to the ruffian herd. They will recompense him now, I hope, as he deserves." "Hey!" cried the blunt Stryver. "Did he, though? Is that the sort of fellow? Let us look at his infamous name. Damn the fellow!" Darnay, unable to restrain himself any longer, touched Mr. Stryver on the shoulder and said, "I know the fellow." "Do you, by Jupiter?" said Stryver. "I am sorry for it." "Why?" "Why, Mr. Darnay, do you hear what he did? Don't ask why in these times." "But I do ask why." "Then I tell you again, Mr. Darnay, I am sorry for it. I am sorry to hear you putting any such extraordinary questions. Here is a fellow who, infected by the most pestilent and blasphemous code of devilry that ever was known, abandoned his property to the vilest scum of the earth that ever did murder by wholesale, and you ask me why I am sorry that a man who instructs youth know him? Well, I'll answer you. I am sorry because I believe there is contamination in such a scoundrel. There is contamination in such a scoundrel, that's why." Mindful of the secret, Darnay, with great difficulty, checked himself and said, "You may not understand the gentleman." "I understand how to put you in a corner, Mr. Darnay," said bully Stryver, "and I'll do it if this fellow is a gentleman. I don't understand him. You may tell him so with my compliments. You may also tell him, from me, that after abandoning his worldly goods and positions to this butchery mob, I wonder he is not at the head of them. But no, gentlemen, said Stryver, looking all round and snapping his fingers. I know something of human nature, and I tell you that you'll never find a fellow like this fellow, trusting himself to the mercies of such precious protégés. No, gentlemen, he'll always show 'em a clean pair of heels very early in the scuffle and sneak away. With those words and a final snap of his fingers, Mr. Stryver shouldered himself into Fleet Street amidst the general approbation of his hearers. Mr. Lorry and Charles Darnay were left alone at the desk, in general departure from the bank. "Will you take charge of the letter?" said Mr. Lorry. "You know where to deliver it." "I do." "Will you undertake to explain that we suppose it to have been addressed here, on the chance of our knowledge where to forward it, and that it has been here some time?" "I will do so." "Do you start for Paris from here?" From here at 8. "I will come back to see you off." Very ill at ease with himself and with Stryver and most other men, Darnay made the best of his way into the quiet of Temple, opened the letter, and read it. These were its contents: Prison of the Abbaye, Paris, June 21st, 1792. Monsieur, heretofore the Marquis, and having long been in danger of my life at the hands of the village, I have been seized with great violence and indignity, and brought a long journey to the on foot to Paris. On the road I have suffered a great deal, nor is that all. My house has been destroyed, razed to the ground. The crime for which I am imprisoned, Monsieur, heretofore the Marquis, and for which I shall be summoned before the tribunal, and shall lose my life without your so generous help, is, they tell me, treason against the majesty of the people, and that I have acted against them for an emigrant. It is in vain I represent that I have acted for them, and not against, according to your commands. It is in vain I represent that, before the sequestration of immigrant property, I had remitted the imposts they had ceased to pay, that I had collected no rent, that I had had recourse to no process. The only response is that I have acted for an emigrant. And where is that emigrant? Ah, most gracious Monsieur, heretofore the Marquis. Where is that emigrant? I cry in my sleep. Where is he? I demand of heaven. Will he not come and deliver me? No answer. Ah, Monsieur, heretofore the Marquis, I send my desolate cry across the sea, hoping it may perhaps reach your ears through the great bank of Tilson, known at Paris. For love of heaven and justice, of generosity, of the honor of your noble name, I supplicate you, Monsieur, heretofore the Marquis, to succor and release me. My fault is that I have been true to you. Oh, Monsieur, heretofore the Marquis, I pray on you to be true to me. From this prison here of horror, whence I every hour tend nearer and nearer to destruction, I send you, Monsieur, heretofore the Marquis, the assurance of my dolorous and unhappy service. Your afflicted Gabelle. The latent uneasiness in Darnay's mind was roused to vigorous life by this letter. The peril of an old servant and a good one, whose only crime was fidelity to himself and his family, stared him so reproachfully in the face that, as he walked to and fro in the Temple considering what to do, he almost hid his face from the passers-by. He knew very well that in his horror of the deed which had culminated the bad deeds and bad reputation of the old family house, in his resentful suspicion of his uncle, and in the aversion with which his conscience regarded the crumbling fabric that he had supposed to uphold, he had acted imperfectly. He knew very well that in his love for Lucy, his renunciation of his social place, though by no means new to his own mind, had been hurried and incomplete. He knew that he ought to have systematically worked it out and supervised it, and that he had meant to do it, and that it had never been done. The happiness of his own chosen English home, the necessity of always being actively employed, the swift changes and troubles of the time which had followed on one another so fast that the events of this week annihilated the immature plans of last week, and the events of the week following made all new again. He knew very well that in the force of circumstances had yet yielded, not without disquiet, but still without continuous and accumulating resistance, that he had watched the times for a time of action, and that they had shifted and struggled until the time had gone by, and the nobility were trooping from France by every highway and byway, and their property was in course of confiscation and destruction, and their very names were blowing out, as was as well to himself as it could be to any new authority in France that might impeach him for it. But he had opposed no man, he had imprisoned no man. He was so far from having harshly exacted payment of his dues that he had relinquished them of his own will, thrown himself on a world with no favor in it, won his own private place there, and earned his own bread. Monsieur Gabelle had held the impoverished and involved estate on written instructions to spare the people, to give them what little there was to give, such fuel as the heavy creditors would let them have in the winter, and such produce as could be saved from the same grip in the summer, and no doubt he had put the fact in plea and proof for his own safety, so that it could not but appear now. This favored and desperate resolution Charles Darnay had begun to make, that he would go to Paris. Yes, like the mariner in the old story, the winds and streams had driven him without the influence of the Loadstone rock, and it was drawing him to itself, and he must go. Everything that arose before his mind drifted him on, faster and faster, more and more steadily, to the terrible attraction. His latent uneasiness had been that bad aims were being worked out in his own unhappy land by bad instruments, and that he who could not fail to know that he was better than they, but not there trying to do something to stay bloodshed and assert the claims of mercy and humanity, with this uneasiness half stifled and half reproaching him, he had been brought to the pointed comparison of himself with the brave old gentleman in whom duty was so strong. Upon that comparison, injurious to himself, had instantly followed the sneers of Monseigneur, which had stung him bitterly, and those of Stryver, which above all were coarse and galling, for old reasons. Upon these had followed Gabelle's letter, the appeal of an innocent prisoner, in danger of death to his justice, honor, and good name. His resolution was made. He must go to Paris. Yes, the Loadstone rock was drawing him, and he must sail on until he struck. He knew of no rock, he saw hardly any danger. The intention with which he had done what he had done, even although he had left it incomplete, presented it before him in an aspect that would be gratefully acknowledged in France on his presenting himself to assert it. Then the glorious vision of doing good, which is so often the sanguine mirage of so many good minds, arose before him, and he even saw himself in the illusion with some influence to guide this raging revolution that was running so fearfully wild.